General statistics show that only 1 in 10 startups survives.
Unfortunately, most startups cannot afford proper governance or professional management.
Every startup is an SMB, but not every SMB is a startup.
Boards truly help startups secure funding and shape their products more effectively.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today we are joined by Armen Kurginian, Chair and member of Supervisory and Advisory Boards of Ukrainian companies, as well as CEO of a Ukrainian firm, and Oleg Zubchenok, lecturer at the Kiev School of Economics Business School, mentor for various accelerators, board member, board advisor to startups, and vice president of the Business Process Management Association.
Yes, thank you. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Today, with Armen and Oleg, we will be discussing the role of boards in startups. Boards in startups differ significantly from those in other companies, whether large corporations or even SMBs. That's why it will be particularly valuable to hear insights from Oleg, who has extensive expertise in working with startups, including at the board level. And as general statistics remind us, only 1 in 10 startups survives, right? In the first year, about 10% of startups shut down. Over 5 years, around 70% close, or even more. In the end, only about 10% of startups turn into successful projects. I've seen statistics showing that advisors, supervisory boards, and boards of directors have a measurable impact on startup performance and success. According to this data, the presence of a board can increase a startup's chances of success by as much as 8 times. In other words, instead of only 1 out of 10 startups succeeding with a board in place, 5, 6, or even 8 out of 10 projects can become successful. How do you assess these statistics?
I completely agree with them. Unfortunately, like most small businesses, startups simply cannot afford proper governance or professional management. I mean professional management, startups don't always have much funding, and by nature their structure requires them to move quickly, which means they constantly need capital. They also don't always have the necessary competencies. That's where boards come in. The first people who truly support startups are usually those who can help them secure financing, or even angel investors who provide capital. Others help shape the product in a more professional, higher quality way. These are typically the first 2 kinds of people who prove most valuable to a startup.
Ole, I have a question. Shaping the product is often essential because in traditional companies, not startups, one of the board's core functions is strategy development, preparing and facilitating the strategic process. So the question is, in real business, say in offline companies, is product development or product refinement essentially the same thing as strategy? Do startups already have a strategy and simply need to fine-tune the product? Or do they need something more than just a product vision, specifically strategizing?
To be honest, from what I've seen, very few startups actually have a strategy. What they usually have is more of a vision from the founders. And even that is often not fully aligned. When there are several co-founders, each of them may see things a bit differently. When a startup begins promoting its product or service, it usually ends up being a collection of features without much structure. They don't always know which markets to target or in what sequence. So some degree of structuring, a minimal level of strategy work, is always needed. I say this also because I have extensive corporate experience. But the truth is, whether unfortunately or fortunately, startups don't need heavy corporate-style strategic planning. But the product side, finding product market fit, testing hypotheses, building what we call an MVP, a minimum viable product, that's exactly the stage where startups also need additional expertise. Often you'll have 2 founders, both with technical backgrounds. That means the business perspective isn't always present at the ownership level, so they bring in people from the business side who can help them move much faster, and ideally those people
come from the industry itself. They bring sector-specific expertise.
That would be great. So when we talk about additional expertise, for instance, if a startup is planning an innovation in passenger air transportation, they will absolutely need a technical expert. That could be a technical specialist or a board advisor, but having expertise in the specific sector they're targeting is crucial. That's why already at the MVP stage, startups usually look to acceleration programs for people. Sometimes even mentors are assigned in a way that matches their needs, whether it's B2B or B2C markets, or industry-specific expertise. A mentor is brought in, and if the collaboration goes well, that person can later join as a board advisor. This can be on a paid or pro bono basis, and I think we'll get into that later.
So the question is, do these boards exist only up until an investor comes in, or can they continue beyond that stage? If the person responsible for securing funding is, as I understand, one of the key priority roles, then the question is, what happens next once the funding has been secured? Does the startup, with the same board, move on to structuring processes and developing strategy, or is the board replaced with another one, or how does it usually work?
Well, typically, if a startup's idea is highly compelling, all board advisors are eager to stay involved and capture some share of its success. From what I've heard and know, for example, there are board members who focus on investments and securing funding. They may receive compensation not only in the form of equity or ownership. They might also get a bonus linked to the size of the funding round, meaning a direct cash component. And then, at some point, it shifts to a stage where they say, okay, we're fine for the first phase, but moving forward, you'll need to engage with funds. At that point, we probably don't have that much experience ourselves, and it may be necessary to bring in someone else. But generally, when it comes to the financial side, if people see that the startup continues to grow its services, explore new markets, test hypotheses, and attract initial customers, they're happy to keep working with it. Meanwhile, other board members may join at a later stage. For example, based on my own experience, my main focus has been business structuring and applying a more corporate, standardized approach. So my services or my approaches are more needed at the stages when the MVP stage has already been passed, and then it's time to structure things, set up the first processes, help with hiring, implement digital tools, set up some metrics, KPIs. These things are not always essential at the very early stage of a startup. That's why I see the mentor's profile and background as a kind of puzzle. At different stages, a different format of expertise may be required.
The boards we usually work with together with Armen are boards of SMBs or companies larger than SMBs. And the two main areas of focus for such boards are strategy and systematization of the business. Regarding systematization, Oleg, based on what you've just described, of course, for example, you may have several partners who don't have a business background but instead a technical one, which is critical for the project's development. But this also means that, since they are not business people, they may struggle to reach agreements among themselves. As the business grows, the likelihood of conflicts increases significantly. This is where the board's role becomes important, for example, in establishing a partnership agreement or introducing elements of governance, right? It may not be full-fledged corporate governance, but at least some mechanisms of oversight and governance.
This is a very timely question because, unfortunately, such conflicts tend to escalate in startups as they grow and raise more capital. And when investors are already involved, if proper strategic planning and agreements on next steps were not put in place, conflicts inevitably arise. Typically, in a startup, one of the founders takes on the CEO role while the others report to them. Even if ownership is more or less equally distributed, in day-to-day operations there is still a need to submit reports. For example, documenting what has been done, who was met with, or updating information systems like, and then directive matters start to emerge. Managers and team leads begin supervising subordinates, even though 2 or 3 of them may all be founders. This is often where conflicts arise. Unfortunately, most startups only begin thinking about agreements and rules once conflicts have already surfaced. Unfortunately, my own experience also confirms that this is very common. It's something that should be addressed early. And looking back how I can clearly see it. To even begin these conversations, you first need to build trust. It's very difficult to walk into a startup and say, okay, you're going to do this, this, and this. Let's make this the first priority, that the second. Instead, you need to show that you're useful, contribute in the areas where you're allowed to, deliver value, and only then gradually start introducing suggestions. For example, guys, maybe it's time we start thinking about KPIs. Or, we've just hired our first operations manager, let's document the processes. Or, let's prioritize our products because we can't realistically execute everything at once. Or even, let's at least build a simple financial model so we understand how much cash we have left for the next 6 months. That's one of the main differences I see compared to SMBs. In an SMB, there's usually some level of stable revenue, which allows for planning, while in a startup, that discipline needs to be built. In a startup, once funding comes in, and especially with technical staff in IT and tech who are usually quite expensive, the money can be spent very quickly. After that, there may be a period where cash runs out, while the team still needs to engage in long fundraising conversations before the next round. This creates a very risky dynamic. You can certainly come in with templates and try to implement systems right away, but without trust being established, it rarely works. From what I've seen, unfortunately, many startup founders are not yet mature enough in this regard. They tend to see corporate structures as something that slows them down or even harms their growth until trust has been built.
But in reality, that mindset often leads to very dangerous situations. Because if there's no systematization or clear strategy from the very beginning, then even if fundraising is successful, there's a high likelihood the capital will be used ineffectively, simply because the structure and strategy aren't in place.
Absolutely. I've even seen cases where investors finance startups in tranches and say, no, until you do this, this, and this, I'm suspending further funding because those milestones are critical. Or they may decide, we're not going to do this at all. And sometimes startups simply continue operating as separate projects or products. That's not even the worst outcome, since more often the reality is that people just go back to employment or move on to other projects. From a risk perspective, this is exactly why agreements are so important. There need to be clearly defined levels of authority. For example, what decisions belong to the board of owners? And what are the CEO's powers and responsibilities? What exactly board advisors can do, whether they vote or have other roles, is an important point. That's where an experienced business advisor can really add value.
We always recommend creating a decision-making matrix that clearly outlines the role of the owners, the management, and the board. And it's very interesting that you just mentioned board members voting. In the case of an advisory board, right, that essentially changes its nature. It stops being a purely academic advisory body. Instead, it becomes an advisory board with additional powers. In other words, a customized board.
From what I've seen, since resources are limited, it's very difficult in startups to find someone who isn't involved in operations at all, meaning that in practice everyone ends up handling some areas of work, and in my experience this usually results in a management board that overlaps with an advisory board. For example, if communication with someone is needed or a meeting or conference participation is required, the same person might serve both as a board advisor and, say, the one responsible for business development in certain markets. Here it depends more on what the board advisors are interested in regarding this or that startup and how they see its future. Sometimes I even joke that when the startup scales and becomes very big, I'm essentially building my own next job position there. I'll come to you, but please first set up some kind of structure or format so that it can actually be used. But while you're still at an early stage, let's keep communicating and working in the way we can for now.
Oleg, a question. Regarding boards in startups, when we set up a board, we usually try to create some additional synergy from the dialogue that the board enables between the board itself, the founders, and the management team. An exchange of ideas in a way that 1 + 1 = 3, so that something valuable emerges from this foundation. As I understand it, a startup board is more like a group of advisors, right? Meaning each person joins with their own specific purpose. First of all, is there a board chair, someone who unites everyone and tries to put together this puzzle of different people? And secondly, is each person actually contributing their part? This person is responsible for the product, this one for finding investment, but does their work actually have a positive, cumulative impact on the startup's future?
I believe it definitely does, but not in such a systematic way as you described. Unfortunately, in startups, it tends to happen a bit more randomly, because first of all, the founders or owners usually try to bring in advisors or board members with whom they already have a relationship of trust. These can be very different people, not necessarily the ones best suited for the role, and then there often isn't enough time, resources, or motivation to really integrate them. So it ends up looking more like separate, fragmented contributions rather than a cohesive system. Formally, yes, there is usually someone heading the board. But often it's like this. If one founder is the CEO, then another one formally chairs the board, whether it's the owner's board or an advisory board. In most cases, though, the CEO primarily uses the advisory board for their own benefit to shape the strategy and define directions. So overall, the CEO is the one leading this process. I haven't seen many cases where other board members take the lead on areas like hiring, HR, or people operations. Those kinds of integration efforts are quite rare. Plus, when we talk about investment advisors, their primary objective is more or less to generate returns. They don't really care whether it's done in a way that keeps everyone happy and avoids conflicts. Their focus is more on preparing the round. You need to build a financial model. You need to prepare the investment pitch deck. You need to hold the conversations, put everything in place. Then the money comes in, and from there on, how things develop is mostly up to the owners.
Advisors aren't accountable for the long-term future of the startup or for how the funds will be used.
Unless they're in it for the long run, which often they're not, since many are more focused on getting their commission and preparing the package. And that's fine too, it has its role. There are also law firms that assist with due diligence and structuring. That's an important part of the process as well. But the best case scenario is when the startup founders can bring in long-term board members who will help the company grow and support it over the next 5 to 10 years.
Though that usually comes at later stages.
Still, it seems to be the case.
Yes.
It's very interesting. There are different approaches. Some say boards should be created even before there's an actual business. That is, when there is just a business idea, it already makes sense to create a board. Others argue that for a board to be truly effective, the business needs to reach a certain scale first. How does this usually work in startups? When is the right time to form a board? At the idea stage, or once there's already some foundation inside the startup?
I think it really depends on the type of collaboration you expect with board members. Often when founders already have some startup experience, they may know people who can help a bit with marketing. They might help set up a website, test a landing page, or assist with interviews, for example, if they're working with someone on industry research and need to find people for in-depth interviews. But unfortunately, most startups don't have the resources. They can't really offer much beyond maybe some future equity or something along those lines. And it's very difficult for them to find people who are willing to work consistently for cash compensation. The best case scenario is finding someone who says, okay, I'll get compensated later once you raise funding, and in the meantime, they start helping with structuring. That's a great setup, but in reality, as long as there's no cash flow or investment yet, a startup has very little to offer, which is why, in practice, it often looks more fragmented, different people making individual contributions here and there to help move the startup forward. My understanding is that, for example, once there's operational revenue and money coming in, then it becomes possible to plan salaries or even some sort of subscription arrangement for board members.
Yes. Typically, we look at keeping the total board maintenance budget under 10% of net profit. Because if that budget exceeds 10%, we see it as a sign that the situation isn't very sustainable. That is, at some point, the company might struggle to maintain board operations. That's why we use the 10% threshold as a benchmark. But of course, at the early stage, a startup may not have any net profit at all.
And from what I've seen, sometimes, depending on the results a startup is able to achieve, this can be either a good or a bad thing. In some cases, if you compare not to net profit but to the overall team payroll, advisor costs can actually account for well above 10%. From the perspective of success, how much influence they can have and how they've negotiated with the startup, sometimes there's no net profit, yet the board or individual advisors may still be compensated. So yes, that does happen. Unfortunately, there isn't really a consistent theory or practice that could be called a definitive best practice here.
In some cases, compensation can be deferred until a later stage. Once net profit appears, the startup may begin paying out the accumulated amount.
The most common approach, however, is to provide some form of equity, a small ownership stake. Typically, that might be up to around 1%. Sometimes I've heard of other scenarios as well, but since it's a startup, and given the risk profile, there's always the chance that equity will never actually materialize. But I think it's normal practice that when you see a startup doesn't have any positive cash flow, you say, okay, we won't start with this amount until you receive your first money. Once revenue comes in, it could begin with a fixed amount and then evolve into something else. There can also be option schemes offered, but in my view, it's not very ethical to demand that up front when resources are so limited and the startup can barely get off the ground, yet money is being spent on consulting. I've even seen law firms and consulting companies take the approach of saying, give us something minimal so we at least break even, or we'll even do it pro bono, but we'll add your logo to our portfolio to showcase that we support you. Right now, that's a very popular narrative, especially with Ukrainian startups and companies that need help. And formally, everyone is waiting for the moment when these become industry-focused, expertise-driven businesses. Once there's something compelling, they're eager to be part of it and to access that expertise. So the approach is often, let's agree on some minimal arrangement and then we'll move forward from there.
Options or equity for board members is a very common practice in the US, and for example. In Ukraine, this approach isn't yet widespread, and we'll see how it develops here and to what extent it takes hold. But once a board member becomes a shareholder, they can no longer be considered fully independent. That is, he becomes dependent board member, even if the ownership stake is small.
A fraction of a percent.
They become dependent because they hold equity. The question is, does that hinder their role or actually help?
My view is that it helps. From my corporate experience, we were always trained as management to treat the business as if we were owners, even if we weren't. That meant focusing on building systematically and ethically, avoiding reputational risks. So I believe that when board advisors or board members also hold ownership, they tend to be more focused, more committed, and ultimately less exposed to risks. I think it's a good idea when board members receive some share of equity, whether up front or through options or another mechanism.
As we discussed earlier, it seems clear that every startup is technically an SMB, but not every SMB is a startup. Everyone starts somewhere, but typically, by the time a small or medium business forms a board, it already has positive cash flow, at least to some extent. That's one of the key differences between SMEs in general and startups. Another is execution. In SMBs, we constantly run into the issue where the board can plan something, but execution lags behind. And when execution stalls, the next step is to either work with the team, train the team, or change the team in some way. In other words, it triggers a set of follow-up actions. In a startup, as I understand it, at the early stage, the role of a board member isn't really separate from operational activity. For example, if someone is responsible for fundraising, they don't just advise on how to do it, they actually go out and raise the funds.
The same applies to operations, product, or sales. For better or worse, it's not enough to simply give recommendations. Trust is built through hands-on involvement. These days, founders are very advanced in leveraging artificial intelligence, and they often face the dilemma: what can a board member actually do that ChatGPT or Gemini or some other tool can't? Because I've tried this myself, and the AI gave me all the recommendations, but what I really need is someone to roll up their sleeves, implement those recommendations, deliver results, and then have the conversations that move things forward. That's why I'm not sure how SMBs are currently grappling with the challenge of integrating AI in comparison. These days, since most startups already understand corporate frameworks well, many of the drafts I work with are initially generated by AI, for example, prepared by the CEO or someone else. And then the task is to adapt, verify, and prioritize them. So the pace is much faster. Nobody is asking, how should we do this anymore? Instead, they typically bring 3 AI-generated options and ask, which is the best way forward? And can you help us refine this one, for example? That creates more challenges for board members, I think, compared to working with more established businesses.
So you could say this is almost a third role. First, you have board advisors who provide recommendations. Second, you have a formal board with responsibility and binding decisions. And third, in startups, board members often take on an additional execution role within their domain.
I'd also add that in more established companies, board practices are generally more standardized and uniform, whereas in startups, they remain highly situational. In startups, this can vary widely. How many hours are spent, what the rates are, how compensation is calculated, what future equity shares look like, and so on. In other words, there's usually no standard structure at this stage. That tends to come later, once there's real cash flow and perhaps millions of dollars in investment secured. From my own experience, I haven't yet worked with startups that raised more than $1 million, but those with several $100,000 are still at a stage where they don't have a formal board. Things are managed more through agreements on who can contribute what, and often no one even monitors board members closely. In fact, there may not even be regular meetings. Instead, there are specific areas where someone steps in to support the team or the startup's CEO in executing the planned tasks.
Ultimately, this raises the question of the transition from a startup to a corporate business. For successful projects, that point comes sooner or later. And when the owner or co-owner is also the CEO, other shareholders are usually directly involved in the startup's day-to-day work as well. Of course, the time eventually comes when the CEO's expertise alone is no longer sufficient to manage the business effectively. At that point, of course, a more robust system becomes necessary. When the original founders are running the business together and there's mutual trust, the system can remain simplified with lighter controls. But once there's a need to bring in external talent from the market, the structure inevitably has to become more formal, with stronger controls and recognizable elements of governance.
But as you very aptly noted earlier, that's exactly the moment when a startup transitions into a corporate format, and perhaps at that stage it's no longer accurate to call it a startup. Once a startup generates steady operating income and begins to corporatize, structuring processes, people, and operations, it's fair to say it's already beyond the startup definition.
Personally, I use profitability as a sort of criterion for that transition. In other words, when the company generates enough revenue to sustain its structure and cover its core operating expenses, excluding R&D investments, it starts to resemble a proper business, one that can be scaled further. And an interesting observation I've made is that founders, especially in tech, often aren't particularly enthusiastic about taking on managerial tasks. In fact, they are much more likely to delegate the CEO role to someone from the board once the business reaches that stage. So probably if some board members have ambitions to eventually lead the startup, it's better to join as a board member first, understand how everything works, and then later on take over part of the business and continue managing it. Because in practice, when founders are successful, they often move from one project to the next or pursue expansion opportunities. In such cases, they may look for someone to manage certain parts of the business, for example, operations in a particular country or external expansion. But it's usually very difficult to find an external hire who fully understands the dynamics of the startup. That's why founders often look to internal people. I've actually seen this in practice when advisory board members stepped into executive roles while the founders either moved on to new projects or focused on other initiatives alongside.
Why are they called advisory boards in each case?
Well, in most cases I've encountered, they're simply referred to as advisory boards.
And do owners also join these advisory boards?
Not necessarily. Advisory boards may include managers and in some cases also the owners.
Typically, the owners don't have a formal board. Instead, they rely on advisors whose role is to give guidance to the owners. If the owners themselves are part of that board, it looks a bit odd, since they would essentially be advising themselves.
It seems that's exactly how it works. At least in the startups I've seen, resources are always limited, and the founders prefer to keep their finger on the pulse. It's never a case of, advisors, please handle this on your own and just come back to me with a recommendation. For better or worse, the CEO is almost always directly engaged with the advisors. Roles shift constantly, since the advisory group often overlaps with the owners, both investors and founders. Sometimes they also bring in external colleagues to join the advisory board.
In small and medium-sized businesses as well, it's very common for the owners to be part of the board. They may be in a dependent position on the board, but in almost every case I've been involved with, the owners were members of the advisory board.
No, not exactly an advisory board. In practice, what I've seen is that advisory boards very quickly evolve into custom boards or advisory boards with additional authority.
Perhaps the presence of the owner is what drives this shift. Once that happens, the advisory board starts to function more like an executive body.
In fact, they begin making decisions. If you look across the spectrum of boards, at one end you have purely advisory boards. They provide recommendations, but don't make decisions. Their role is simply to advise the owners or top management, who then decide whether to adopt or disregard those recommendations. On the other end of the spectrum, you have advisory or supervisory boards with actual decision-making power. Supervisory boards are rigid structures, usually formalized in the company's charter or other legal documents. Their decisions are binding and must be implemented across all levels of the organization. There is quite a wide gap between advisory boards and supervisory boards. We see custom boards as positioned somewhere in between. They are more than advisory, but not yet fully supervisory. They are most effective for small and medium-sized businesses, where flexibility and speed of decision-making are essential, and where owners may not yet have a fully structured way of engaging with the business. On the one hand, such boards can begin the gradual transfer of authority, eventually delegating it to an external CEO, but that transition typically takes time. In other words, this process is still ongoing, so the role of the owner is not only that of a shareholder, but also of someone actively involved in certain operational matters.
From my experience, I haven't really seen supervisory boards in startups. They simply don't exist in that form. Advisory boards and custom boards represent the real spectrum here, and for better or worse, owners can both listen to the board and make decisions at the same time. So the two processes often happen simultaneously. It's not a formal sequence where someone prepares a document, the board reviews it, and then the owners or the CEO, who is often also a shareholder, makes a final decision. Instead, it can sometimes feel more like a democratic process. The board may hold a different view than the owner, and while it has no formal authority, the majority opinion can still prevail. The structure really depends on how the team organizes its work. I've also seen cases where key people, technical leads, product heads, and so on, were brought into these advisory or hybrid custom boards. They were even given voting rights on certain decisions, such as setting priorities on the product roadmap for the coming year. So I would say that there's a bit of a pattern here, but it's very systematic. Well, every startup is a bit different in its own way.
And did it actually work? In every project I've been involved in, whether individually or, for example, together with Armen, there always comes a moment when the board members must decide, do they want to remain academically pure as an advisory or supervisory body, or do they want to be as useful as possible to the business? Unfortunately, those two things don't always align.
Exactly. From what I've seen, the idea of having a purely academic partner in a startup is usually temporary. Over the long term, priorities shift very quickly. Sometimes the kind of support a board advisor provided earlier is no longer relevant. For example, all resources might now need to be directed toward a new funding tranche or the next investment round. In that context, no matter how much you talk about operational efficiency, it simply isn't the priority. Instead, what's needed is preparation of pitch decks or readiness for investor conferences. And the reality is you can't just tell the team, friends, please don't bother me for the next 2 months. This isn't my responsibility. Goodbye. Reach out later. Once you've secured the funding, come back and then we can talk, because at that point there will be structures worth building. So yes, for better or worse, it's more of a living organism. The key is to build trust and create the ability to take on new projects or expand existing directions within a startup.
Okay, Oleg, so the type of board most commonly used in startups is closer to a single-tier board of directors?
Yes, that's right.
Where top managers participate alongside independent members of the board.
Yes, absolutely. Meaning the board may include advisors or owners of the business, even if they don't hold managerial roles, as well as key executives, with all of them jointly involved in governance.
And they make decisions?
Yes, they do. Some may prepare the decisions in advance, but in my experience, there's often a more democratic approach. They want to hear everyone's voice. And in practice, owners and board advisors often carry nearly the same weight in that process as key executives.
So in voting, it's typically one person, one vote without weighting by ownership percentage?
Yes, but that applies more to strategic matters such as fundraising or major product decisions tied to money. In those cases, it's the owners and investors who vote, and their influence depends on their equity share in the company. But for managerial or operational issues or more specific matters, it's usually one person, one vote.
It's interesting, we often talk about how startup boards differ from SMB boards or more traditional boards, but I think it's just as important to recognize what unites them. Ultimately, when we talk about these custom boards that do make decisions, it's the participation of the owners that legitimizes those decisions. Without the owners, they remain only recommendations that the owners may or may not act upon, either directly or through management. But when the owners themselves are part of the board, even in a dependent role, those decisions automatically become binding because the owner has effectively signed off on them. I have 100%, so we can implement this right away. For example,
there was a meeting, a decision was made online, the protocol goes in parallel, but the decision is made immediately. This is much faster. You can move forward right away, rather than waiting for the board to vote, then for the owners to review it, and only afterward add their own input. So here it's single level and significantly faster. Another aspect is that meetings can be irregular, and sometimes even a quorum-type situation might occur. In practice, the people who were present at the meeting made the decision, since they were the key participants. Others, unfortunately, if they didn't join, simply execute what was decided. There's no formality around status. Well, what can you do? Sometimes the pace at which a startup moves is much faster. Decisions need to be made more quickly compared to a more corporate structure. For example, I recall that in large companies, they begin preparing the next year's budget already in August or September, long before that budget is actually put into use.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the first part of our discussion on boards and startups. See you in the next session.